In previous lessons, there have been frequent references to the character of Macbeth, his morality, his choices, and his tragic ending. But eventually, it is really up to you to decide what you make of this character. What do you really think of Macbeth, the person? I'm going to try and give you some pointers. Now, when Macduff kills Macbeth and brings his head to Malcolm, the heir apparent to the throne, um, he says that this is the head of a dead butcher. This dead butcher and his fiend like queen, a dead butcher. Now, that's the first question you're going to have to ask yourself. Is that how you see him? What is to be learned from this story? What is to be learned from this tragedy? Well, I'm going to try and give you some pointers. Now, firstly, Macbeth certainly does have blood on his hands. There is no question about that. He himself says, "What hands are these, or hands are here? Ha, they pluck out mine eyes. Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? No, this my hand will rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine." So that is, of course, suggestive of a great sense of guilt and that and of knowledge that the murder will not go unnoticed, not in this life and not in the afterlife, and that it is too big to, as far as he's concerned here, to be forgiven. He carries on in his bloody path, and to such an extent that he himself once again says, "I'm in blood stepped in so far that should I wade no more, returning will be as tedious as go over." In other words, if you look at this picture of the blood, he's halfway through a river of blood, and whether he turns back or whether he goes forward in his bloody path is not going to make any difference. He is really full of the guilt of the murders that he has himself committed and has had others commit. So he knows that he's in a river stepped so deep that he is lost. So what we need to ask ourselves now that we know that he is really a murderer, when we look at the entire character, is he a victim, a hero, a villain? Is he too full of the milk of human kindness, or is he a bloody tyrant, a dead butcher? So you're going to have to assess this character for yourself, and this might even be an essay question. Is he to be utterly condemned as an evil, inhumane monster without any redeeming features, or does he have any just claim to our respect and our compassion? And that is what we're going to try and find out. There are certain points of respect and compassion in Macbeth that's worth looking at. We do know that in the beginning he is courageous, he is loyal, he is successful. He's this leader in the war, and he's in the forefront. He virtually wins this battle for Duncan. He really fights like a true hero. And he is also honored, so he fights courageously. He's honored by his king with an award after that, with the title of the Thane of Cawdor. And the king actually says, "I've just begun to plant you, and you are going to grow, so I'm going to look after you." And when he is first confronted by the witches, and he is still a good person, he reacts to this prophesying of the witches with foreboding. He says, "Why does my hair stand on end? Why does my heart beat at my ribs at the mere thought of killing someone?" He has most certainly definite moral scruples in the beginning, as he is considering the murder. He decides and then he undecides. He gets manipulated by his wife after he decided that he will continue with the murder no longer, and then she gets at him again, and then he decides again. So there's definite moral scruples in the beginning. And he is, to a certain extent, and you can try and ask yourself that question as well. Is he a victim? I feel to a certain extent he is a victim of the promptings of the Weird Sisters, and also the wife's urgings and her insinuations about his adequacy and love for her. In other words, if he doesn't do it, she will think that he also doesn't love her. She equates his obedience to her and her promptings to his love for her. So look carefully at those quotes that suggest that. So he is in a way a victim, and you can think through that one. He is not callous despite his ambition. He is ambitious in the beginning. He's a good man. He's full of the milk of human kindness, says his wife, and he recoils with horror at the thought of murdering Duncan. So in the beginning, we really see a man who is a good man. And also, we see a lot of remorse and revulsion after the murder, after the deed of regicide. The king has been killed. And he himself says, after the murder, when there's a loud knocking at the south gate, he says, "Wake Duncan with thy knocking. I would thou could." He so wishes that he could undo the murder and this just wake the king. So we also need to understand that after having killed the king, his life is quite miserable. He has a life. He lives a life of deception. He has to put on false appearances. There is a lot of mistrust. There is a lot of anxiety. He loses his friends. He loses his thanes. They run away from him. His leaders, the leaders in his army, run away from him, and he gets alienated from his wife. And then, if you look at, for instance, his reaction to the death of his wife, how he seems callous there, where he is so filled with regret and the futility of the life that they are now living, that he says she should have died hereafter. So he lives a miserable life. He cannot even sleep. There's a total destruction of his peaceful sleep. He has nightmares, and he is an insomniac. And he constantly suffers fears of retribution. He's constantly looking over his shoulder because somebody is going to get back at him for killing the king. There's a lot of insecurity in his life, and he is totally isolated from his community. He loses his friends, his wife, his thanes. And after the murder of Banquo, which he also sort of does in desperation because he's looking over his shoulder, he is worried that Banquo might come back and kill him because of the fact that he killed the king. He in desperation, he goes and visits the witches again. He also suffers the consequences of hallucinations. And he also has eventually, which some say is a point of compassion, eventually he has the courage to face the enemy. Although we know that it's a foolhardy act, but he says, "At least I'll die with harness on my back," which is a very sad thing, because he's knowingly going into his final fight, and he sees that it as an act of courage, whereas we know that it's not an act of courage. But what I'm saying here in this entire slide is that we must look at the kind of life he had to live after. Although it's his own fault, he brought it on himself, but what kind of life did he have as a king? Of course, there are many points of condemnation that we can look at. He does stoop to dishonest means to attain the throne. We know that. We know, although he is plagued by the horror and the enormity of the murder Remember, he says he will not be able to wash the blood from his hands. Why? We can ask ourselves. He knows better. Why doesn't he repent? Why doesn't he follow the example of the former Thane of Cawdor, repents and dies a beautiful death? No, he does not repent, despite the fact that he knows better. He rejects his moral awareness. He has a lot of moral awareness, we can see, but he rejects it. And his vaulting ambition drives aside any other further moral considerations. And he also allows his wife to emasculate him, to manipulate. Why does he allow him? He is a man. Why does he do it? Why does he listen to her? Why does she overwhelm him with her attacks? So he does commit the most heinous crime imaginable, that of killing the rightful and the holy, the anointed king. And he does that through being manipulated by forces that he himself knows are evil, and a wife that he knows are just being manipulative. So there's more. Let's see more. Look at more of these points of condemnation. He willingly sells. He knows better, but he sells his precious jewel, in other words, his soul, to the devil. He's deliberately playing a false role. He says, false face must hide what false heart doth know. He doesn't show any moral scruples later on when he plans the murder of Banquo. He even hides it from his wife, and he shows no moral scruples. He himself then goes and manipulates the poor murderers into thinking that they really needed to kill Banquo. So he's very deceitful. And in that, as I said, in the murder of Banquo, he shows the ultimate hypocrisy, because he says to Banquo that he is going to be the chief guest at the feast that night, and then, well knowing that he had already organized the murder of Banquo and Fleance, and he knows that they are not going to return to be in time or even there at the banquet. And then after the death of Banquo, of course, we know that Fleance escaped. After the death of Banquo, he persists in his bloody path. He doesn't ever think of stopping. He says, okay, I'm so far in blood, let me carry on. I may as well go on. So he persists. And in the process, he associates himself with witchcraft. He keeps on wanting to know more and more and more from the witches. And he consorts with the devil, right? He takes a bond with evil, knowledge, and assurances. In other words, he believes the equivocations of the witches. And Macduff's planned murder, of course, is the ultimate murder, because what on earth did Macduff's wife and poor children, innocent children, do to deserve the death and the slaughtering at Fife? It is a totally senseless murder, because they are no threat to Macduff himself. Macduff himself is sitting in England, but he has, just out of spite, he had these poor innocent people murdered. So in the end, I want you to go and have a good look at the character of Macbeth, and prepare yourself to perhaps get an essay about his character where you are going to have to evaluate his actions. So take a look at those quotes and make sure that you have a number of quotes that will substantiate what you have to say.